Welcome everyone to another episode of Nerve Pinch MMA. This is episode 3 and I'm your host, Sam Orpilia. It's been a great month in the UFC since our last episode with some amazing performances at UFC 146, but we'll talk about that a little later. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the big week coming up on UFC with not one, but 2 events coming up. UFC on Fox 4 Maynard versus Guida on Friday, June 22nd, and UFC 147 Franklin versus Silva 2 on Saturday, June 23rd. There's a few good fights on both cards that I think will be good value for us to bet on, and I'll cover them in our first segment, Against the Odds. And quickly after going over my picks, I'll tell you how I think the fights will play out in our final segment, Breaking It Down. But first, let's talk about what happened since our last episode. So first off, we're going to be talking about, we're going to recap UFC 146, which was Dos Santos versus Mir. And I wanted to talk about 2 incredible performances that we saw. Cain Velasquez over Antonio Silva and Junior Dos Santos versus Frank Mir. Both incredible first round wins that, proved to everyone why they were heavy favorites in those fights and why those are the 2 best heavyweights in the world. They both fought in November against each other. Looks like they're going to fight again this coming November for a heavyweight championship rematch. By far the 2 best guys in the world at that division. I could probably watch those guys fight 9 or 10 times in a row. I'm actually kind of hoping that when they fight, Cain Velasquez will win so that there will be a 3rd fight. So we can see these 2 guys battle it out a 3rd time. But incredible performance by both guys. I can't wait to see what both of them can do next. In this segment of Against the Odds, we'll be talking about UFC on Fox 4 and UFC 147. We'll be talking about the fights that have been announced so far. First up on UFC on Fox is Ross Pearson at -220 versus Cub Swanson +170. Pearson should be the favorite here and is rightfully expected to win here by the odds makers. I recommend no play. Next up is Brian Ebersol, -200 versus TJ Waldberger +160. Experience and being a more known factor is the reason why Ebersol is the favorite. I recommend, again, no play. Sam Stout -340 versus Spencer the Kingfisher at +260. Stout's on the upside of his career while Fisher's on the downside. Odds makers have pegged this correctly, no play. Maynard -400 versus Clay Guida at +300. Guida is an excellent value here because of his toughness. I recommend a play here on Guida because this will be a lot closer than people think. Fabricio Verdum -600 versus Mike Russo at +400. I say stay away. I don't see Russo having much of a chance to win this, and -600 is too little of a payoff to bet on Verdum. And in the main event, Vanderlei Silva +125 versus Rich Franklin -155. Bet on Silva. Silva's the underdog here, but in my opinion is the favorite. Why? I'll explain why in the next segment, Breaking It Down. In this segment of Breaking It Down, we're going to be talking about both cards, UFC on Fox 4 and UFC 147. We're going to talk about the main card fights, and on 147 we're only going to talk about 2 of the fights because those are the only 2 that have been announced as of today. So on UFC on Fox 4, first fight up is Ross Pearson versus Cub Swanson. Both these fighters are stand-up fighters that love to bang. I think Swanson has a little bit more of a chance of finishing this fight by submission, but I think you're going to see 15 minutes of 2 guys standing up and fighting. Right now, Ross Pearson's the favorite, and I would have to agree with that. I think he's properly favored in this fight because, we've seen him fight against Edwin Barbosa, who, even though he recently lost to Jamie Varner, has looked good with sharp striking in all his fights. And Cub Swanson, probably a little bit more athletic, but I don't think he's as good of a striker technically. And over 3 rounds, I think Ross Pearson's advantage as a striker is going to show. He's currently a 220 favorite. Cub Swanson's at plus 170. It's about right if you ask me. The next fight up is Brian Ebersol versus TJ Wahlberger. And this is a good fight. Recently beat Claude Patrick. A better fighter than most people gave him credit for, even though he has 64 fights on hand, which is mind-boggling that a guy who's only 31 has 49 victories in his career. But it took him a long time to make the UFC, and he's made an impression since he's come. Wahlberger is an up-and-coming fighter, good with submissions, which has shown to be Ebersol's weakness. So I do see a chance of him coming and winning this fight on the ground, but Ebersol is and should be the favorite in this fight because he is the experienced, wily guy who always seems to find ways to win, whether it's with his great Muay Thai or just surprise grappling that he seems to pull every single time. He looked good in all his fights so far. I don't think Wahlberger is quite ready to beat Ebersol. So I think even with Brian Ebersol being a minus 200 favorite, I think, again, this is another fight that's pretty much rated correctly. The next card is the co-main event, Sam Stout versus Spencer Fisher. Now this is a rematch from, it's hard to believe it's been 5 years since they last fought back in 2007. Sam Stout's a heavy favorite in this fight, and it's kind of funny in the sense that Spencer Fisher has a better record in the UFC than Sam Stout. The last time they fought, Spencer Fisher clearly won the fight. But it's been 5 years, and now Spencer Fisher is 36 years old. Sam Stout's only 28, hitting his prime. And Sam Stout, even though he hasn't gotten he's gotten progressively better in the UFC, but he hasn't gotten as good as some of the other fighters his age have gotten, especially with the influx of talent from the WEC. But he's still a good mid-range fighter. He's going to win fights he should win, lose fights he should lose. Whereas Spencer Fisher, 1-4 in his last couple fights, 36, probably on the downslope of his career. It should be an interesting fight in the sense that we'll get to see how far along these guys have come 5 years later. Sam Stout going from 23 to 28, hitting his prime. And like I said, Spencer Fisher hitting it down his career. I look at it from the point of view of I want to see how much 5 years of a difference in aging, getting better and getting worse, is going to make for both these guys. Sam Stout, heavy favorite. I think that's just about right. And in the main event is Clay Guida versus Gray Maynard. Now Maynard is coming in as a heavy favorite, minus 400 as a favorite in this fight, and rightfully so. He is, you know, he almost beat, well, he fought Frankie Edgar 3 times already. He's won 1-1 against him. Even though he lost the last fight against him, it was a fight that I felt that he was competitive in, and I think Frankie Edgar just has his number. But when I look at this fight, there's one thing to remember. Even though this isn't a title fight, it's a 5-round fight, and what Clay Guida has shown is that guy is almost an unstoppable force, and that you have to stop him from fighting. He will never stop. He's relentless. And I think over 5 rounds, even though Clay Guida is not the favorite and Gray Maynard is, I think over time, over 5 rounds, that edge that Gray Maynard has is slightly decreased, because as time goes on, guys get tired and you never know what can happen. And because Gray Maynard's not much of a finisher, there's a good chance this fight is going to go into the 4th and 5th rounds. And with Clay Guida being a plus 300 favorite, I think it plays into his strengths of great cardio and relentlessness, and of playing up to the judges. You know, he's the guy that always fights hard. The crowd's always on his side, and I think judges see that, and they're slightly influenced by that kind of thing. And I think over 5 rounds, I think Clay Guida is definitely going to have some type of chance of winning this fight here. And in the UFC 147, the 2 fights, we have Fabricio Verdum is fighting against Mike Russo. And Verdum is a minus 600 favorite. It's hard to imagine that in this day and age that a top fighter fighting another top fighter can still be that big of a favorite in the fight. But you know, I looked over Fabricio Verdum's last 10 or so fights, and that guy has probably had the hardest 10, 11, 12 fights of any UFC fighter, maybe any heavyweight has ever had. I mean, it's murderer's row. He's fought Alistair Overeem twice, Sergey Koritnikov. He's fought, Roy Nelson, Fedor, Antonio Silva, Mike Kyle, Brandon Vera, Junior Dos Santos. I mean, he's fought the hardest guys in the division, top 5, top 10 guys almost every single time. And it's easy to forget how good this guy actually is because he's beaten a lot of them. And as much as I love Russo, I mean, the guy's got the heart of a champion, the chin of a champion, as we saw against Todd Duffy. But he's a shorter fighter, he's a lighter fighter, he's not as strong, he's not as versed as well in jiu-jitsu. And I just don't see any way in which he can finish Verdum, because Verdum has never been submitted. And that's pretty much Russo's only chance of winning this fight. As much as my heart wants to root for Russo and put money on this guy, I think Verdum is going to win this fight pretty easily. And in the main event, we have Wanderlei Silva versus Rich Franklin. And in that fight, Rich Franklin won the last matchup, which was, I think, about 2-3 years ago. But I've seen the fight. I've watched the fight many times, and every time I watched, I still think Wanderlei Silva won the fight. And I look at this, and even though Rich Franklin is the favorite, if the government, if the judges had picked Wanderlei Silva to win that fight, which I believe he did, the odds would be different in this fight. So I'm not going to let the government tell me who won the fight last time. I know who won. Silva won the fight last time. I think he should be the favorite. I think good money should go on Silva in this fight because his one weakness, as we've seen in the last 3, 4, 5 years, is that he seems to be able to be knocked out pretty easily by power punchers. Chris Liebman's knocked him out. Quentin Rampage Jackson has knocked him out. Dan Henderson, Mirko Krokop. But as we saw in the last fight, I don't think Franklin has the power to knock out Wanderlei, and because of that, this fight is almost definitely going to go to decision or a knockout by Wanderlei. So with him being the underdog in this fight, I definitely see him winning this by decision or by knockout. And thanks again for joining us for another episode of Nerve Pinch MMA. You can follow me on Twitter, and you can join me again in a couple weeks. I'll be covering UFC 148, Silva versus Sonnen 2 on July 7th. So look for an episode coming up before that. So until next time, pinch somebody.